Hello, and welcome to the LSJ News US Election Special.
Everything that you're about to see has been recorded within compliance with the government guidance. As you can see, we are socially distanced right now.
It's been a turbulent 4 years since Donald Trump was elected as US President. 2020 has seen the devastating effects of a pandemic. So coming up today, we'll find out how COVID-19 has affected the US election.
The influence of Black Lives Matter on the election.
But firstly, we're going to take a look at how a US election actually works.
The 2020 election in the United States is on track to have the highest voter turnout in over a century, a direct response to its high stakes. However, there are many stark contrasts between the US and the UK governmental systems to take note, many of which Americans are still figuring out about their own country on the way to the polls. An easy one to mess up is that America is not strictly a democracy. Civil rights milestones in the last century often overshadow the narrative, and the fact that the US is actually considered a federal constitutional republic that practices democratic processes. Serving a 4-year term, the president controls both the state and federal government, adverse to Britain, where that power is divided independently between the prime minister and the queen, which one could argue is more of a figurehead position. Like Parliament, the US checks and balances through Congress, a legislative branch of two bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Serving 2-year terms, the number of House representatives correlates to the population of each state. For example, my home state, California, houses 40 million Americans, and that's 10 million more than any other state in the country. So we have 53 members representing us in the House versus a less populous state like Alaska, which only has 1 member, though it's still a large state in size. Leveling the playing field, each state has 2 senators that serve staggered 6-year terms, regardless of population counts. Election season begins in the 2 years leading up to November 3rd, Election Day, as candidates hit the road to campaign. Campaigns are either funded by grassroots efforts or corporate interest groups such as the National Rifle Association or Big Pharma. Candidates use these cross-country tours to convince the American people that they're the right candidate to seat the Oval Office. Quite different from the UK as well, American voters must register to vote prior to the election. So for example, if you were hoping to vote for a Republican candidate, you can't be registered under any other political party besides Republican. And then once registered, you can vote for any candidate running under your chosen party. Voter registration became a prerequisite in post-Civil War America, largely to prevent immigrant voters from casting their ballot. But it's not as cut and dry as all the grade school books would like us to believe. The popular vote is actually outweighed by the Electoral College, which is a body of 538 electors, and they are the buffer that prevents the American people from voting a candidate directly into office. The college runs a winner-takes-all system. So once the popular vote is tallied, whatever majority wins turns that state red or blue, and all electors are assumed to follow. Here's where the term swing state comes into play. Seen most recently in the 2016 election, even though nearly 3 million American voters voted in favor of the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, Trump secured 304 electors to her 227. On record, there have only been 5 instances, such as the 2016 election, where the president-elect didn't win by plurality. Regardless of the outcome, record number turnout is a catalyst for change in the United States, because let's not forget that the party with the most numbers year after year belongs to Americans who leave their ballot empty and choose not to vote. Brooke, Becher, LSJ News.
But what has the US political climate been like since 2016, and how might this election turn out? I spoke to Dr. Mike Slavin, a senior lecturer of US politics at University of Lincoln, about these topics.
You know, the 2016 election was a pretty close election, and Trump was a very divisive candidate in particular. And since then, he has governed in a way that has not really expanded his appeal or sought to build many bridges out to those who didn't support him to begin with. And the political climate, of course, for a while in the United States has become increasingly polarized and divisive. So this really began probably 20 years ago or more, but has reached really new levels now. So you increasingly do see a situation where 45% of people are just absolutely on one side or the other. On the other hand, there are shifts that happen. So there are people who do shift their allegiance or who shift from one side to the other over time. One thing that's appealing about Joe Biden is he's put this on Twitter: "When I'm president, you won't have to worry about my tweets." Like, that's something that his campaign has put up. And that actually, I think, has some appeal to a lot of voters. Perhaps people who gave Trump a shot in 2016 thought that maybe he'd change a bit when he became president. Turns out he hasn't changed at all.
What do you think are the sort of 5 key issues which you think could decide this election this year?
Coronavirus, racism and police brutality, and then coronavirus. Him getting it in the past month has only seemed to confirm to people that he never took it seriously enough, which I'm generally against, kind of making moralized judgments of people who, we shouldn't associate illness with those sorts of moral things typically at all. But I do think it's fair to say that Trump didn't take it seriously in the White House or policy-wise. I think the other major issue that came up this year was, of course, the George Floyd protests and the whole issues around racism in America and police brutality. And in particular, a lot of voters thought that Trump just did not provide the sort of leadership that was necessary amidst that. He came out with this strong kind of anti-protester, law and order message, which might appeal to his base, to the people who voted for him 4 years ago, but really seems to not be the right thing to do for a lot of people. And in that context, Joe Biden, who's a elder statesman who's been around for a long time, really emerged as a figure who looked likelier to reunite the country. And I think that has carried over to people's impressions of how he would lead on coronavirus as well.
The term fake news became prominent in the 2016 election and has continued to grow into the 2020 election too. I spoke to Senior Lecturer of Journalism, Alex Lefchuk, about this.
So Alex, going back to the 2016 election, do you think that fake news helped get Donald Trump elected?
Well, the general accepted viewpoint is that fake news played a part in the election, but maybe not to the extent that we were led to believe at the time. There are general suggestions that the attempts to manipulate opinion, and that's ultimately what fake news is, a way of actually manipulating public's opinion from foreign countries, and clearly Russia was one of the lines that was suggested as being at the heart of this, were taking place, but not to the huge extent that we kind of saw being claimed. I think, as with most of these kind of things, they tend to carry with them a certain resonance, a bit like dropping a stone into a pond, and you get ripples that roll out. And yes, there are impacts that are being made, and certainly I think the ways in which the 2016 election historically will be viewed as a social media oriented election, even more so than Barack Obama, who made great use of Twitter, of course, to support both of his successful campaigns. In 2016, it was a different kind of approach that was being taken. And I think at that stage, a combination of, in many ways, arguably the perfect storm for Republicans of an electorate in America who were desperate for change and voting for change, in the same way as, perhaps some might say tragically, over here we had Brexit and a variety of other things. People actually just voting as a protest without necessarily appreciating who or what they were voting for.
Do you feel that Trump's criticism of the media has led to an increase in the influence of fake news?
Well, the current incumbent of the White House and the President of the United States of America has got a track record in terms of using the media, manipulating the media. He was, after all, a very successful reality TV star with the American version, in fact, the American original Apprentice. So he's certainly well used to manipulating the media. And certainly if he is naive, then I think there are a number of other people who are more than happy to support his activities and so on. And it's very straightforward to call things out. But as I always like to say, if you point at somebody with your finger, bear in mind there are three fingers pointing back at you. And I think sometimes we live in a culture where there's so much antagonism and there's so much adversarial behavior that's being developed that we need to almost take a step back. Now, your question actually was relating to Trump and his line vis-a-vis fake news. I think, as in most cases, there's a grain of truth in terms of what he actually puts together. It is there if you sift through the systems. But he tends to go for the populist vote. And certainly there is this sense that whenever we see news which is clearly untrue, it's relatively straightforward whether you are portrayed as the villain or the hero to actually say, oh, that's just fake news. It's one of the reasons why maybe from a journalistic point of view, it's vital that sources are checked, that facts are checked, that there's a due diligence that goes into news stories before we simply say, yeah, that's got to be true because it says so there.
Do you feel that people can't trust the news anymore in the US, that there's been a sort of loss of trustworthiness for what's being put out?
Fox News was one of the early proponents of taking a very right-wing, very Republican viewpoint and almost became a parody of itself, and still arguably is in terms of its views on a number of issues. And I think other news agencies that are carried by the main networks, the ABC, the NBC, and so on, and indeed CNN, endeavour as far as possible to actually ensure that they are delivering cogent, coherent, and indeed accurate information. And I think that's very commendable. It's interesting getting that sense of balance. I mean, again, drawing the parallel with British sort of viewpoints, it's often, I think, behoven upon us to actually check out more than just BBC websites, because the BBC, despite their protestations, sometimes do take a particular line which maybe Channel 4 or ITV actually don't adjust to. And I think certainly we're also seeing in radio news these days the views of the Talk radio network, the Times radio network, and so on, just in terms of events that are happening as far as we're concerned vis-a-vis COVID-19 and so on, and mask wearing and such like. That's probably a discussion and a debate for another day. To go back to the question about America, I think ultimately most journalists in America are doing the best they can do under very difficult circumstances. And I think that the drive, certainly of 24-hour rolling news, where there is a huge pressure for journalists to effectively produce stuff regularly and be new, be novel all the time, sometimes takes away from the ability that journalists used to have, and indeed good writers and good scholars have, of just taking a moment for either themselves or somebody else to just reflect on what it is they're actually writing. To use a fictional line from the character Perry White in the Superman series, good reporters don't report the news, they make the news. I think we've reached that stage now, and that came from a 1978 movie.
And lastly, who do you think will win?
I think Joe Biden will probably make it, just about. I think that's my sort of initial intuitive feel at this stage, but I don't think Donald Trump will go easily.
There have been many factors of this election: coronavirus, social media, and how it will impact the UK. I spoke to Jared Mickey, an ex-politics and history student. So to begin, do states tend to vote a certain way?
Yeah, there are certain states that are sort of locked in as a Democrat or a Republican state, but they're the ones you sort of, they're normally big ones that tend to swing elections and stuff. So when Donald Trump won, I think it was like Florida and some other places that are quite large, that really just knocked the table down for him in terms of, because he's got quite large chunks of America in those sort of states, as opposed to some of the smaller areas that Hillary Clinton won.
And what do you think the better outcome will be for the UK?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Donald Trump, he seems to very much love this country. He's constantly talking about wanting to help Boris with his Brexit stuff, and I don't know. I don't know if Joe Biden would be as willing to go out of his way to secure any kind of deal with us, because at the end of the day, we're not exactly the most important country on his roster for some reason. It's on Donald Trump's. I think, personally, if we're looking at a no-deal Brexit, I think Donald Trump is probably more advantageous for us.
How well do you think Donald Trump has handled the coronavirus pandemic?
I personally think because Trump has been in office for a couple of years before this hit, I think he would have been more equipped than Joe would. If Joe were to take over right now, he's got to go through the process of, it's his first time in the White House as the president. Obviously, he's been there as vice, but it's very different when you're at the head of the table. He's gonna need at least a year, like anyone does, to really settle in and start getting things working for him.
Do you think the voting patterns that we're seeing at the moment could potentially change before or on the day of the election?
Well, there was a thing out today where they did a sort of estimation on most of the sort of postal ballots that have been sent in early, and it's thought that a large majority of those are Democrat votes, which means when it comes down to it on the day, you're going to have probably a majority of Republican voters voting on the day. So at the moment, it seems like Joe Biden's in the lead. On the day, everyone will probably be going, oh no, there's a bunch of Republican votes. In the end, I think it'll be really close.
What do you think the impact of social media has had on the election?
Liberal voices online and in news and stuff, they are so loud, and they are literally the only things you will hear on the internet. So it seems like there's a lot of people shouting Biden. I think a lot of people are in for a shock in terms of how many people are prepared to vote for Trump. And I think as much as people maybe don't want that to happen, and I'm not the greatest fan in the world of the idea, I think he might just swing it for a second term.
Well, I'm now joined by the LSJ News US political correspondent, Matt Shaw. Matt, what are the key issues which you think are going to decide this election?
I'd say the first one has to be the COVID-19 pandemic, which has dominated the whole race so far. And then tied into that is the economy, which is always important, but now even more important as they go into deep kind of depression. And we've got race and racism. I think that's a really key issue with the Black Lives Matter protests going on. So I think those are kind of the three main issues that they're going to be debating. And I think the Supreme Court as well, maybe not so much for the average American, but for those who kind of are more interested in politics, the Supreme Court's a big one.
How have each presidential candidate's campaigns gone so far?
Well, it's been interesting so far. They've both had their kind of strengths and weaknesses, but I'd say all along the Biden campaign kind of ran a bit stronger, just because obviously Trump's the incumbent during the pandemic, and all the campaign messages in the world can't distract people from the problems that are going on. So Biden's always had this kind of stick to hit the president with, and Trump hasn't had much to respond with.
What have the messages been from Trump? What has he led his campaign with?
Trump's going on this kind of message of building the economy back up. He says that he built the strongest economy in the world, and he wants to get it back to that after the pandemic. He says it wasn't his fault, all of that. And he runs on a campaign of kind of making life better for the average American. Biden has a similar kind of campaign, making life better for the average American, but he's able to kind of hit out at Trump's lacking response with the pandemic.
Do people still have faith in Trump's ability to make the economy better?
That's a good question. Trump for ages had this strange ability to convince people that he was good with the economy, even when all of his other talking points were seen as weaknesses. Economy always held out strongest, but then quite recently, I think in the last month or so, it kind of it flipped, and people started seeing Trump as not stronger on the economy.
And what's the general public opinion towards the way Trump has handled COVID-19?
So COVID from the start's been probably one of his weakest points. Initially there was this kind of rallying around the flag effect, so people were kind of supporting him. I think his approval ratings boosted slightly, but it didn't take very long, and then it dwindled really quickly, and now for quite a while now, quite a few months, he's been seen as poor on handling the pandemic, and Joe Biden's been seen as more competent with it.
What would Biden do to change the way the USA is like handling and reacting to this pandemic?
Well, it was interesting in the vice presidential debate. Mike Pence said that their plans. I think he accused the Biden campaign of plagiarizing the Trump administration's plans, but they are quite different. I think Biden said that he wants to put more focus on testing and PPE and making sure that things are locked down if necessary, wherever possible, to keep things safe. And Trump all along has had this kind of stronger focus on just keeping things open and making the economy run smoother. But it's not like other problems, so it's not going to go away. If they just kind of push it under the rug, it's probably going to get worse, and it is doing.
We've seen that President Trump over the last 4 years has often denied the existence of climate change and it not being as serious a topic as many scientists believe it to be. Has he stuck with that going into this election?
You could say, yeah. There was an interesting moment in the last presidential debate, the final one, where they did discuss climate change and the usual things came up. But when Biden said that he would push to end the fossil fuel industry to try and phase it out, which is part of his Green New Deal that he's proposed, Trump kind of saw that as a winning point and drew a lot of attention to it, because Trump's things all along has kind of been protect jobs, keep the infrastructure in place, keep fossil fuels going, in fact increase them, whereas Biden's much hotter on phasing them out and going to greener alternative energy.
And with fracking, is Biden opposed to that or not? It seems to be a bit of a contentious issue.
Yeah, he said, I think several times now, and so has Kamala Harris, that he's not going to ban fracking, but it's still an accusation that gets thrown at him a lot. Trump, I think, seems to think it's a really, really good attack to use, that he's going to ban fracking and thousands of jobs are going to be lost. But Biden said from the start that he doesn't want to outright ban fracking. He just wants to move towards cleaner sources of energy.
Yeah. Well, like Matt said, race and racism will be a key issue to decide the US election this year. We now go to our reporter, Luther Odame.
From Tupac Shakur to Kendrick Lamar, from Muhammad Ali to LeBron James, famous African Americans have been using their platform to get their voice across for decades. This year, the killing of George Floyd sparked outrage across the world, and more importantly, the USA. I spoke to rapper LB1999X about the Black Lives Matter movement, how he thinks it will affect this year's election, and how important he feels it is to get his voice across in his music. Over the years, from dawn of day, numerous African Americans have been killed through police brutality. I mean, you've got like Eric Garner and Tamir Rice 2014, got Stephen Clark 2018, George Floyd and and more. So what do you feel motivated the uprising this year compared to other years?
Now, I feel like as a young African American, a young African descent, I feel like, and a man of color, I feel like at this point we saying that obviously what the approach we've been taking is not working. So now we got to try a different approach. I don't know if you ever seen an interview with Tupac. He made an analogy that stuck with me to this day. You know what I mean? And I seen this interview when I was 12 years old. I'm 28 now. And he said he had an interview, I guess, before he went to jail. He said, this is how it's like being a black man in America. We knock on your door and we asking you, we singing politely, yo, can we come in? We're hungry. We need food. Can you help us? And they deny our request. You feel me? And we knock on it again. We try a different approach. Hey, this is who I am. This is what I need. I'm hungry. Can you feed me? Close the door in my face. Then the third time we're not knocking on the door no more. We kicking down the door. You feel me? You feel me? And that's where I feel like that's where it's getting to. Because honestly, I'm gonna be real with you. Marching is not working. You feel me? Because till this day, it's still young brothers that look just like me, that are younger than me, that are still being killed. They look just like you, that's still being killed.
Go back a couple of months. What was it like in LA living through the riots?
It was different. It's different. I've been in protests and riots before, because in Washington D.C. when Mike Brown had passed away, we had the riots. When the KKK came up to DC, we had riots and stuff like that. When Trump rallies came, we had riots. So it was different being here, because I'm used to seeing all black people in Washington, D.C. congregate for things like that. Here, I seen all nationalities congregate. And that was the beautiful thing about it. You know what I mean? And that's what I had to open my eyes to, that damn, bro, you're not in a state that's majority black anymore, and you have people that's not even of your ethnicity standing with you. That's a beautiful thing. That was an eye-opener, because I didn't expect people to do that. You know?
Yeah.
You feel me?
Yeah, I get you.
And honestly, there was more outraged than I was. Now, granted, the riots, I really didn't agree with, because, I mean, some people were doing it for personal gain. But at the same time, bro, I look at it like this, man. These businesses have insurance. These people are upset. Again, it goes back to the analogy I made to you about the Tupac thing.
Mm-hmm.
We tired of asking y'all for help. Y'all not going to give us help. We're going to help ourselves. You feel me? And if we got to act out, you're going to feel the hurt we feel, because y'all not listening to us.
How do you think each of the candidates view the Black Lives Matter movement? That's the main two, Trump and Biden.
These never been in these communities. You know what I mean? They never walked. They never really experienced or even sat there and witnessed what's going on in these communities. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm from Washington, D.C. That's a political state. That's where the White House is. You think these same political people are standing with the people that live 2 blocks away from the White House? They understand and are empathizing with them? No, they're not.
So
you
do
feel
think
me?
Biden siding more with us to get votes?
Yeah, of course. He basically just told us, if you don't vote for Biden, you ain't black.
Right,
how you gonna tell a black man that, bro? And you don't even walk the shoes we walk. You feel me?
Lastly, I just want to ask, how do you feel the African American community can get the best win, if possible, from this election coming up?
How can we get the best win? If we understand, community is key. You feel me? Voting. I mean, the presidential election is one thing, but you still got your community elections. You still got your judicial judges, and you got other things that take place in your community that you can take care of first.
Mm.
Not just hoping on a big savior from the president. You know what I mean? Attack your community first. Community first. That's what I think it is, bro. Like, I gotta know my neighbor. I gotta help my neighbor. You know what I mean? I gotta be able to, if I'm living in these places with these people, I gotta help my community. So as African Americans, I feel like we do need to coexist with each other and come together and help community.
Okay.
This has been the LSJ News US Election Special.
To keep updated, you can follow us on Twitter at LSJ Tweets or on Instagram and Facebook at LSJ News TV.
Thanks for watching. Bye for now.